Anatomy 32, Chapter 23, the Respiratory System, Topics Lungs and Alveoli. So, the lungs, as we know, are found in the thoracic cavity and also within the pleural cavity. And this is because each lung is surrounded by a pleural membrane. The pleural membrane is a two-layer structure with a thin space between the two layers that is filled with fluid. So you have the visceral layer of the pleura that lies on the lungs, directly on the lungs. Then you have the parietal layer of the pleura that is adjacent to whatever is surrounding the lungs, which in this case would be the rib cage. And then that thin space between the pleural cavity that is filled with serous fluid. And the function of the pleural membrane is to provide lubrication to the lungs and to reduce friction, because as the lungs constantly expand and contract, they are rubbing against the thoracic cage, the rib cage, and that is going to lead to friction, which will damage the lungs. But with the pleural membrane present, that helps to reduce the friction the lungs experience as they expand and contract. All right, there are two lungs, right lung and left lung. The right lung has three lobes, a superior lobe, a middle lobe, and an inferior lobe. Between the superior lobe and the middle lobe is the horizontal fissure, and between the middle lobe and the inferior lobe is the oblique fissure. The left lung, on the other hand, only has two lobes, a superior lobe and an inferior lobe, and they are separated by an oblique fissure. So three lobes on the right lung, two lobes for the left lung. The left lung also possesses a cardiac notch, this little depression into the lung. The cardiac notch is present because the left side of the heart is bigger than the right side, and so the left lung has to make room for the heart. And then it's also worth mentioning that the diaphragm, a critical muscle for breathing, is directly inferior to the lungs and also forms the border between the thoracic cavity and the abdominal cavity. All right, so again, the right and left lungs, both lungs have an apex, a superior apex that's basically a point to the lungs, and then inferior they have a broad base. Again, the left lung has that cardiac notch. Both lungs also possess hilum. Hilum is an area where structures go in and out of an organ. So in this case, for the lungs, the hilum is where the main bronchi enter the lungs, as well as blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, nerves, and so on. Here's just another view of the two lungs. As you can see, the right lung is a little bit broader and shorter than the left lung. And this is because of the liver. The liver is a very large organ on the right side in the abdominal cavity, and it pushes up into the thoracic cavity a little bit, requiring the right lung to be broader and shorter to make room for the liver. However, the overall volume in each lung is about the same. So the lungs can be broken down into 10 bronchopulmonary segments. You do not need to know the names of these segments or their locations. Just know that each bronchopulmonary segment is receiving air from a specific segmental bronchus. So each bronchopulmonary segment is receiving air from a specific segmental bronchus. All right, so the conduction zone ends with the terminal bronchioles. So again, trachea splits into the main bronchi, which split into the lobar bronchi, which split into the segmental bronchi, which then become smaller and smaller, eventually becoming bronchioles, and finally the terminal bronchioles. So at the end of the structures whose only function is to move air in and out. From there, we enter the respiratory zone. So after the terminal bronchioles is the respiratory bronchioles. And the respiratory bronchioles are the first structures that allow for gas exchange between the air in the lungs and the bloodstream. And this is because the respiratory bronchioles have these little pouches connected to them. These pouches called alveoli. One alveolus, many alveoli. From there, the respiratory bronchioles split into alveolar ducts, which also have pouches associated with them, and those then lead to the alveolar sacs. The alveolar sacs looking kind of like a cluster of grapes, and each grape in the cluster is an alveolus. And of course, there are lots and lots of blood capillaries, pulmonary capillaries on the surface of the alveolar sacs and individual alveoli, because that's necessary for gas exchange. And the theme here when we get to the alveoli is thin. The alveoli are extremely thin. They are simple squamous cells, and that thin structure allows for the gas exchange to be possible. So an alveolus is sort of a pouch or cup-shaped structure that's sticking out, and it is made up of simple squamous epithelial cells. So simple, only one layer thick, squamous, super thin epithelial cells. And of course, the alveolus has multiple pulmonary blood capillaries lying on its surface. There are a variety of cells found in an alveolus. There's the type 1 alveolar cells. These are the cells that form the alveolus, structurally form the alveolus. So these are the simple squamous epithelial cells. They are known as type 1 alveolar cells. Then there are type 2 alveolar cells within the alveolus. Type 2 alveolar cells secrete a fluid surfactant. This is a chemical that mixes with water and alters the water surface tension, and this helps to prevent the alveoli from collapsing. Again, the alveolus is not a very structurally strong structure, so we need the surface tension of the water decreased by the production of the surfactant by the type 2 alveolar cells. And then the third cell is the alveolar macrophage. Again, a macrophage is a white blood cell, and the macrophage is going to be traveling around within the alveolus, engulfing any pathogens, any dust particulates, anything it finds that it feels shouldn't be within the alveolus. Unfortunately, there are things that the alveolar macrophage cannot engulf and can build up over time within the lungs. All right, the respiratory membrane. The respiratory membrane is formed between the alveolus and the capillary, the blood capillary, and the respiratory membrane allows oxygen to go from the air in the alveolus into the bloodstream and allows carbon dioxide to go from the bloodstream into the air of the alveolus. The respiratory membrane is made up of the alveolar wall plus its basement membrane plus the basement membrane of the capillary plus the capillary wall. So the respiratory membrane is basically composed of two squamous cells, two flat cells that are very thin. And it's this very thin structure that allows the gases to diffuse across the respiratory membrane. And that is it for this part of Chapter 23.